Part 2. Flint Marko felt his freedom slipping through his fingers like sand. For a brief time, a wonderful time, Marko had been certain that he had lost his pursuers. He was quickly disabused of his notion, however, as he heard the sounds of barking dogs in the distance. Damned police. Damned lawmakers. Why couldn't they leave him the hell alone? Why did they insist on pigeonholing him into the role of the bad guy? Why couldn't they see the shades of gray in their black and white world of cops and robbers? It was like some big kid's game to them, and he was the prize. He had eluded them sufficiently to get out of New York, jacking a car and driving into one of the more remote areas of the New Jersey marshlands. But he had to fill up the tank. While the pump was filling the car, Marko had gone to the bathroom, and when he came out, it was just his crappy luck that a cop car had likewise chosen that exact moment to pull in to gas up. The instant that the cop in the passenger seat glanced Marko's way, he knew he'd been made. He hadn't even bothered to go back to the car. He'd turned right around and bolted for the back of the service station. The howling protest of the cop car's siren assured Marko that he'd been absolutely right. The back of the service area opened onto a steep drop-off, which in turn led into a heavily wooded area. Marko vaulted over the low mesh fence that lined the perimeter of the service area and rolled down into the brush. By the time the cops managed to get to the top of the hill, he was already sprinting into the woods. "Police! Stop where you are!" one of them shouted, and a warning shot snapped a branch off a tree just to his right. He ignored it. Instead, he vanished into the concealing forest and ran headlong without the slightest care as to which way he was going, or where he was going to end up. The only thing that mattered was that he got as far away from them as possible. The ground had slowly become boggier, and as the trees thinned out, the grass got taller. He was no longer able to run with assurance. Instead, every step felt like a tough slog. There was a full moon, thank God, but every time it went behind the clouds, he found himself tripping and sprawling over random branches, stones, and depressions in the ground that seemed to be there purely to make him fall. A gentle wind blew into his face, and only when he heard the sounds of the barking dogs behind him did he realize he'd had yet another piece of crummy luck. Because the wind was coming at him, it meant he was upwind of the dogs, and they'd have an even easier time tracking him. But how had they gotten his scent? Obviously, he'd left the car behind in the service station. They sniffed around on the seat, on the steering wheel, the gas and brake pedals. That would have been more than enough to put them on his tail. The grass was now chest-high, the ground spongier than ever. Marko was soaked in sweat. His breath labored. The marsh air was so thick with moisture that he felt as if he were trying to breathe water. Still, the dogs grew closer. How the hell were they managing that? They were lower down to the ground than he was. How could they be moving faster? It didn't make any sense. He glanced back to see how close his pursuers were, half expecting them to be no more than 5 feet behind, and slammed headlong into a fence. He staggered back and fell into the marsh grass. Sputtering and furious over this dead end, he scrambled to his feet and saw, in a dim outline as the moon once again scampered behind a cloud, the closely woven mesh of a cyclone fence. Marko had no time to retrace his steps, and certainly no time to move down the length of the fence to find a way around it. It could run a mile or more, and by that time they'd have him. One choice is no choice, his grandmother used to say. She'd had such high hopes for Flint when he was a child. He wondered what she'd say now. Actually, he didn't wonder. He knew. Flint forced himself to take one deep breath to steady his nerves. Then he sprinted toward the cyclone fence once more. He vaulted as high as he could, and his fingers snagged into the upper links. His feet scrambled for purchase and found some minimal support, but it was mostly the strength in his arms that enabled him to pull himself up and over. Just as he reached the top of the fence, lights hit him from behind. Powerful flashlights, maybe even searchlights. There were shouts of, "Halt! Freeze!" and other orders that Marko was only too happy to ignore. He clambered over and threw himself to the other side. Marko landed heavily, but the spongy ground cushioned the fall. As he got to his feet, he noticed for the first time that a sign was posted on the side of the fence from which he'd come. He hadn't taken the time to read it, probably just a standard keep out warning, as if he cared. Marko started running once more. He discovered that he'd injured his ankle in the fall and was now limping badly, just to add to his aggravation. He heard the dogs barking at the fence, their claws scratching the links. He risked yet another glance, fully expecting to see the police scrambling on over the fence after him. Instead, they were remaining right where they were, on the other side, and were angrily shouting for Marko to come back before it was too late. Too late? Too late for what? For them to catch me? Screw that. To his surprise, the marsh grass suddenly disappeared, giving way to a paved, pitch-black field. Something had been constructed there. A private airfield, perhaps. Yeah, that made perfect sense. He had stumbled upon a private airfield, and this might be the biggest break he'd ever gotten. All he needed was to find a pilot with a private plane and convince him to transport Marko out of here. He was certain he could do it. Marko was a pretty persuasive guy when he wanted to be. His luck was finally turning. Even his ankle was starting to feel a little better. That was when the ground went completely out from under him. With no warning at all, Marko suddenly found himself tumbling down a massive concrete slope, curved like a gigantic bowl. He desperately tried to find a way to slow his downward skid, but the walls were perfectly smooth. He kept falling, rolling end over end, until finally he skidded to a halt in the bottom of the structure. Marko went headfirst into a large pile of sand. He pulled his head out, sputtering, coughing up granules that had gotten between his lips, his teeth. Getting to his feet, he looked around, trying to get his bearings. Suddenly, a massive light kicked on above him. He had no idea what it was. Oh Lord, what if he'd foolishly broken into not an airport but a prison? Wouldn't that be just too freaking perfect if, in his determination to escape, he wound up back in jail? Marko looked up, shielding his eyes, uncertain of what he was going to see. His jaw dropped. Now that he was looking at it, he still didn't know what it was. It appeared to be about 3 stories tall and bore a passing resemblance to an agitator in a washing machine. The upper section began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. 3 mechanical arms extended above Marko and started whirling. They formed a high-speed arc around him. He tried to find a way out, but the metal arms were moving by him so quickly that he couldn't get past them. It was like being trapped inside a helicopter with propeller blades that were tilted down, blocking escape. On the far side of the bowl, a servo motor whined as a bank of observation windows were being covered by reinforced steel blinds. The noise was sufficient to draw in Marko's attention, and he desperately waved, trying to get the notice of whoever was in there. If the windows sliding into place and blocking any further view of Marko's predicament was any indicator, then Marko had failed spectacularly in his endeavor. At that moment, as Marko felt the hair on the back of his neck standing straight up, and heard the energy around him building up toward what sounded like some sort of detonation, he really wished he'd read that sign before jumping the fence. Knowing that the sign screamed, "Danger, high-energy particle physics test site, keep out," would not likely have made him feel any better. Inside the research facility, the technicians studied the arrays on their computer screens. "Capacitors charged," Ashley Michaels said, satisfied at the results she was getting. "Right," said Dr. Chafin, confirming it. Then he saw something that didn't look quite right, and he leaned toward Blaswell. "Donnie, we got a little fluctuation on one." Adding his own concerns, O'Shea said, "There's a change in the silicon mass." Donnie considered the possibilities, and reasonably concluded, "That's probably a bird." It made sense. Stupid birds saw the pile of sand at the base of the particle accelerator gun, and didn't know it was there to measure molecular bonding. They thought it was someplace convenient to build a nest and lay their eggs. "It'll fly away when we fire it up." The others nodded, satisfied with the explanation. Chafin called out, "T-3 and counting. 3, 2, 1. Initiating demolecularization, announced Michelle, and she activated the cycle. The spinning arms crackled with electricity as the centrifugal force whipped up the sand around Marko. A centralized energy blast triggered an electronic ripple effect that began to spread, bathing Marko and the particles of airborne sand. Marko and the sand began to glow. Had Marko been capable of perceiving things on a microscopic level, he would have seen the particles of sand, single granules no longer than a period in a sentence, being broken down into their atomic components. Glowing from the intensity of the particle gun's radiation, the sand atoms slid between the atoms of Flint Marko's atomic structure, affecting Marko at a fundamental molecular level. Like any human, Marko was a carbon-based life form, but that was about to change. As the glowing silicon atoms of the sand slammed into Marko's carbon atoms, knocking them out of their orbit and taking their place in his molecular structure. It was not an isolated occurrence. The inorganic atoms of silicon dioxide, sand, penetrated Flint Marko's entire body. None of his physical makeup was spared, and he staggered under the barrage. The heaviness in the air that impaired his breathing increased until his lungs felt as if they were full of sand. Now he couldn't breathe at all. He put a hand to his chest as the sand whirled around him, peppering every molecule of his body like a dust devil. He twisted in place to see if the mechanical arms were slowing, if there were any way out of this. He watched in disbelief as his hand started to transform into sand. Transform into sand. Reflexively, he grabbed at his chest and felt Penny's locket nestled against it. There was no practical reason for what he did then. It was entirely instinctive. He yanked the locket free and threw it low. It bounced once, twice, and under the whirling arms, clear of whatever was happening to him. Only in the final seconds of reflection before his hideous fate overtook him did he realize why he'd done it. His desire to protect his daughter was so overwhelming that he couldn't allow even an image of her, an image that had smiled out at him every time he had opened the locket and peered in, to come to harm. At that moment, he realized he was never, ever going to see her again. That knowledge, more than the horrific transformation he was undergoing, caused him to throw back his head and scream. Nothing emerged from his mouth except a geyser of sand. If Flint Marko had been able to see himself, he would have witnessed his features starting to dissolve. Like a million years worth of erosion happening all within a few seconds. His head became sand, and his face began to slide off. Eyebrows, nose, his eyes, his mouth open in a silent howl of protest, and then falling away, leaving his face inhumanly blank and featureless, like a department store mannequin. "Please, no. She needs me. Penny needs her father. I can't die now. I can't." Then, seconds later, his entire body fell apart and was whisked away into a small whirlwind of air that looked like a sandy brown cyclone. "Shut it down? Now?" Chafin was outraged at the timing. He was on the phone with a guard at the front gate and couldn't believe that the call had even been put through to him. They were busy men involved in serious work that was finally giving them proper readouts for the first time. "You can't be serious. Why are you even calling me?" "Because the police are here," shot back the guard from the front, sounding both irritated and nervous. "They said they're pursuing some criminal and that he's somewhere here on the base. And I didn't think it was a good idea to have them stumbling around in the dark while you're testing whatever the hell it is you guys are testing in there." Of all the... Suddenly, the anomalous readings that had been reported came back to Chafin. The readings that had been carelessly chalked up to a bird. Yes, it could still have been a bird. But if a man had been down there by the gun, it would have generated the exact same readings, which could have meant... Oh, hell. "Shut it down!" Chafin abruptly shouted. Everyone gave him stunned looks, their expressions demanding explanations. There was no time to provide them. "Shut it down! Now!" he screamed, the urgency in his voice giving them all the impetus they needed. The particle accelerator deactivated within seconds. As the reading spiraled to normal, Chafin realized that he was gripping the receiver so tightly that his knuckles were getting white. He forced himself to relax and said, through gritted teeth, "All right. Send them back here. But I want an escort with them at all times. Make sure they don't touch anything. We don't need them contaminating the field." He slammed down the phone without waiting for an acknowledgement and sat back in his chair, shaken to the core. The others approached him, looking bewildered. "What happened, Al?" asked Michelle. "Why did we shut down? Everything was going fine. It was the best..." "What would happen?" "What would happen?" Chafin said, ignoring the question and instead responding with one of his own. "If a human subject were trapped in the field that the gun generated." The scientists looked at each other quizzically. "Are you thinking of looking for a volunteer?" asked Donnie. "Because I don't think it's a good..." "What would happen?" Then, as an afterthought, Chafin added, offhandedly, "Hypothetically speaking." There was a moment of silence. And then Ashley Michelle said, "The subject would be dead, I suppose. If everything worked correctly, his molecules would essentially bond with the air. So he would be functionally discorporated." "How do we know he wouldn't bond with the concrete of the pit? Or the sand?" "We don't," Michelle said reasonably. "But either way, he's dead, so what difference would it make?" "None," Chafin admitted. "Probably none." "Al, what's going on here?" demanded O'Shea, taking charge of the situation as the senior technician. "Are you saying there was a person down there during the test?" Chafin pictured what the poor devil's final moments would have been like. Would he even have understood what was happening to him? How long would his consciousness have held on? Would he actually have felt his body falling apart around him? Would he have felt nothing? Or everything? "I hope to God not," was all Chafin could say. The police searched the entire grounds. They paused at the top of the large bowl-shaped pit with the ominous-looking tower, like something out of a James Bond film, protruding from dead center. At first, they wondered how in the world they were going to get down there and inspect it, then concluding that shining the searchlights down would have been sufficient. There really wasn't any sort of cover where Marko could hide. Still, one of the technicians, a twitchy-looking guy with the name Chafin on his ID, had said they might want to check it out. Furthermore, the dogs were sniffing around one of the edges and whimpering in an odd manner. The lights played all along the interior and came down to rest on the pile of sand at the bottom. There didn't seem to be any sign of Marko, and the sand certainly wasn't deep enough for Marko to have buried himself under. "Where'd he go?" wondered one of the cops. The others shrugged. They continued to shine the light down there for long moments, making absolutely certain there wasn't some hatchway or other means of egress that might have eluded them at first glance. Finally, satisfied that wherever Flint Marko had made off to wasn't there, they turned their attentions elsewhere. Curiously, they practically had to drag the dogs away, since the stupid mutts seemed determined to haul the cops down into that pit in pursuit of nothing more than a pile of sand. A pile where, had they looked very, very closely, the police would have seen the glint of a half-buried locket that had slid back down from the edge and come to rest in the sand, as if returning safely home. 6. Dead fathers. Lying to the police officer had been the toughest thing for Peter, but he had done it with confidence and aplomb. As he sat in the waiting room, apprehensively watching the sun crawl over the horizon and wondering if Harry would be alive to see it, he decided that, in retrospect, it hadn't been that difficult after all. He was still so shaken after the night's events and revelations that his vagueness had come across to the cop as genuine shock. The hospital had naturally summoned the police officer when Peter had informed them that Harry was the victim of a hit and run. The cop had sat opposite Peter, notepad in hand, and asked him to recall everything he could. His expression had appeared neutral, but Peter could tell the cop, an older, uniformed officer with a lined face who had seen far too many innocent people hurt in his career, was eyeing him closely, looking for some indication of drug or alcohol influence. Was this really a random accident, or a couple of doped-up young guys who got themselves in big trouble? In Harry's case, of course, it really was closest to the latter. But they could run all the drug-alcohol tests on Harry's blood they wanted, and they still weren't going to detect whatever the hell it was that Harry had put into his system that had transformed him into the new goblin. As for Peter, clearly articulate and earnest as the day was long, he was so obviously not under the influence of anything that the cop relaxed in short order and simply listened. What he heard was a story that Peter kept deliberately vague. They'd been up all night cramming for school, or more accurately, Peter had been cramming and Harry had been helping. They were hungry, there was nothing in the fridge. They decided to go out, see if they could find an all-night eatery. Harry had started to cross the street. Peter had looked away to see if he could spot someplace down the street. Then came the screeching of tires, the hideous thud, and he looked back. There was Harry lying in the street, a car speeding away. A dark car. Blue, he thought, but hard to make sure. No, he hadn't gotten the maker license. "You shouldn't have moved him," the cop said in a severe tone. "Could have done him more harm than good." "I didn't know that," Peter said, looking down, as he had been much of the time. Now he looked up, though, and said with absolute sincerity, "I hope to God I didn't kill him." The cop allowed a gentle, almost paternal smile and said, "You've got the best doctors in the world right here at this hospital. If anyone can help your friend, they can." Peter suspected that they said that at every hospital, but he accepted the reassurance for what it was worth. The cop was now long gone, after giving Peter his card and asking him to contact him if he remembered any more details. Peter continued to pace nervously. He glanced at the clock on the wall to see how much time had passed, and realized with a start that he was supposed to have gotten together with MJ for a late breakfast that morning. He quickly phoned her and got her machine. Assuming that she was in the shower or otherwise occupied, he left a terse message, a Reader's Digest version of what he'd told the cop. Then it was back to waiting, until finally he saw a doctor exiting the intensive care unit. Peter instantly recognized him as the doctor who had asked him earlier what had caused Harry's condition. Peter rushed over, moving so quickly that the doctor was startled and stepped back in surprise. "How is he?" Peter blurted in a rush. "You a relative?" asked the doctor. Peter considered claiming that he was, but then the doctor might start asking for ID, and it could get embarrassing. Besides, Peter was sick to death of lying. "His best friend," he said. The doctor made a face that indicated Peter had no business inquiring, and that the doctor shouldn't even be speaking to him. So Peter added, "His parents are both dead. He's an only child, so..." He took a deep breath and let it out. "I'm all the family he's got." The doctor clearly considered what Peter was saying, then nodded once as if satisfied. "He's going to be okay," he said, and Peter immediately felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Then he grew tense as he sensed a "but" coming. Sure enough. But there's been some memory impairment, particularly his short-term memory. Right now he can't remember the accident or much of anything that's happened to him recently. His tone shifted from clinical to sympathetic. "He's awake if you want to see him." Peter was apprehensive, unsure of just how much Harry had forgotten. Perhaps he didn't recall the details of the battle, sure, but did he remember the events that had led up to it? "Is it permanent?" he asked. "It could be," said the doctor. And he started to move away, clearly heading somewhere else. Only time will tell. As an afterthought, he called over his shoulder, "Keep it brief. I want him to rest." Peter watched him go, and steeling himself for the worst-case scenario, entered the ICU. He asked an orderly to point him in the direction of Harry Osborn's bed, since all the sections were curtained off, and he didn't want to start poking around. The orderly scowled a moment, and Peter quickly said the doctor had given him permission for a short visit, even though visitors weren't typically allowed in the ICU. The orderly obviously wasn't sure if Peter was lying, but apparently didn't feel like calling him on it. Instead, he simply pointed toward one curtained area, then added, "Make it quick." Peering around the curtain, Peter saw Harry lying in bed, eyes closed. Tubes were running in and out of him, his chest rising and falling slowly, with a steady beep from the various monitors. How did it come to this? My God, how did it come to this? Peter thought bleakly. He was about to turn away and leave, when he saw Harry's eyes open into narrow slits. At first, they didn't seem to focus on Peter at all. Then Harry's stare latched onto Peter, and there was a moment of confusion. Peter was certain at that point that Harry had no idea who his visitor was. But to Peter's surprise, Harry smiled slightly, although in a pained manner, as if the mere stretching of his mouth muscles hurt. And he said softly, "Hey, buddy." It was the first time in an age, it seemed, that Harry had addressed him in a manner that sounded like old times. Scarcely daring to believe it, Peter, working hard to control his emotions, said in an offhanded manner, "Hey," as if he and Harry had accidentally bumped into each other on the street. Harry raised a hand to his forehead, taking care not to jostle the tube that was inserted into the hand. "Hit my head." "Yeah." Peter remained cautious, not wanting to say too much, fearful of triggering some emotion or recollection that could shred the moment. He felt as if he were watching slowly hardening concrete. If he did nothing to disturb it, then it would dry smooth and flat. The last thing he wanted to do was scrawl Spider-Man's initial in there. Frowning, Harry said, "Doctor said I was..." He paused, trying to recall. "Hit and run," he said. "Can't remember. Did they get him?" Briefly, Peter had no idea who the him was. He thought Harry was referring to the doctor. Then Peter remembered that a mythical person had been driving a mythical car that he himself had created, and it was important that Harry continue to believe that. "Not yet. They will," Peter assured him. "I can't remember much of anything. I'm thinking about my dad." He sounded bewildered, as if he couldn't figure out why that would be the case. Peter didn't know why either. But if it was because Harry was remembering that he had followed his father's lead and become a cackling, flying maniac out for blood, he sure didn't want his friend's thoughts to continue in that direction. "Doctor wants you to rest," he said. "My dad," Harry persisted. Peter braced himself. "He died, didn't he?" He looked up at Peter with great pools of sadness in his eyes. "Did he die?" It was all Peter could do not to let out a wholly inappropriate sigh of relief, then instantly regretted it. How could Peter be glad that Harry's first moment of clarity was the realization that he was an orphan? Reining in his emotions, Peter said, "Yes, he did." Harry took that in with the air of a tourist who just had some interesting sight pointed out to him. "This is all so weird," he said finally. "It's like I'm looking out at my life from 100 miles away. Like I'm on the outside looking in and it's happening to some other guy. Know what I mean?" "More than you can possibly believe," Peter said ruefully. The curtain was suddenly pushed back. Peter expected it to be an orderly shooing him out. Instead, it was an out-of-breath Mary Jane. Her hair was slightly damp, confirming Peter's earlier supposition as to her whereabouts. He had no idea how she had managed to talk her way into the ICU and chalked it up to the notion that, Once Mary Jane Watson was determined to go somewhere, nothing short of a brick wall was going to stop her. "Hi. Got here as fast as I could," she said, except it was all in a rush and came out, "Hi, got here as fast as I could." She stopped, composed herself, then struck a casual pose that was amusing in its breathtaking artificiality. With a sideways flip of her hair, she said chipperly, "Hello, Harry." A genuine, huge grin lit up his expression. "I know that face," he declared. She walked over to him and took his untubed hand gently in hers. "How you doing?" "I don't know," he said honestly and frowned. "Last thing I remember, I was fine. Somewhere." "The doctor says you're going to be okay," she assured him, answering for Peter the question of how MJ had gotten in here. She'd obviously caught up with the attending physician and had little trouble managing to sweet-talk him. Hell, he was probably down at the gift shop at the moment buying her flowers. That's all that matters. "It's good to have you back," Peter said, meaning that in a way that neither Harry nor Mary Jane was going to fully appreciate. Patting the back of Harry's hand, MJ whispered, "Get some sleep." Harry was starting to fade. "Thanks for coming." A nurse stepped in, mastering an expression that allowed her to look both compassionate and yet firm. "I'm sorry, I have to scoot you out," she said to them. "He needs to rest." She certainly had good timing. Peter had ascertained everything he needed to know, at least for the time being. It was a good idea to get out now while Harry was still thinking of Peter as his friend, rather than the evil creature who had killed his father. Let the former impression sink in and become the lasting one. "See you tomorrow," he told Harry. Harry nodded slightly, sinking towards sleep, and half raised his hand in farewell. As Peter and Mary Jane stepped around the curtain and headed out, he could hear the nurse say to Harry, "You have lovely friends." "My best friends. I'd give my life for them," Harry said, each word suffused with fatigue. Then, a few moments later, he heard Harry say, both by way of informing the nurse and coming to terms with it himself, "My father died." Peter closed his eyes tightly against the sting of tears he felt welling up in them. For the life of him, he didn't know whether he wanted to cry out of sympathy or relief. The bottom of the pit where the particle gun had been tested remained in shadow for a good part of the morning. As noon approached, the continually rising sun finally stretched its rays to the bottom, chasing away the shadows and illuminating a bit of glinting metal that was a little girl's locket. The sand lay there in a pile. The police officers were long gone, reluctantly reporting to their superiors that a golden opportunity, not to mention man-hours, had been wasted. Flint Marko had gotten away somehow. The scientists had never mentioned the anomalous readings that might have been a major clue as to Marko's whereabouts, or more accurately, lack of whereabouts. The scientists' caution was understandable. They were balancing the fate of one random thug against an intense investigation into exactly the type of work that was being done in the facility. Police reports were matters of public record, and the scientists simply didn't need too much information leaking out for anyone's consumption, specifically journalists. The project had been temporarily shut down while the scientists concentrated on studying the readings and results of the previous night. Thus, no one was around to see the sand in the bottom of the pit beginning to stir. At first glance, it would have seemed that a vagrant breeze was responsible. Moments passed, and then the sand started to undulate in a way that could not be explained by anything in nature. Stray particles from all over the pit started moving, seemingly of their own volition. They streamed toward the center area, and other streams joined in, like multiple branches of a river. More and more came together, particles that had been blown or carried as high as the top of the pit. Soon, every grain of sand in the area had met in the center of the pit, forming one large pile. The pile began to move. Slowly at first, and then more quickly, the growing mound began to take the shape of a man. Initially, it was little more than a crude form, like a featureless sculpture made by a 5-year-old. Then the face began to define itself. A mouth appeared where there had been none before, then thin lips. The mouth wasn't closed, but open wide, frozen in the shape of a scream, as if it were constructing itself in accordance with the last memory it carried. No voice emerged from it, and then tongue and teeth became visible, although still little more than vague outlines. There was a loud gasping for breath, but it was more habit than anything else, since there truly weren't any lungs to suck in the air into. Like an hourglass running in reverse, the sandy form began to bear a resemblance to an unfinished sculpture of Flint Marko. It was doubtful that anyone in his family would have recognized him. In fact, it was unlikely that Marko himself would have been able to gaze at a reflection of the flat, featureless creature that had seeped into existence and know it to be him. At that moment, Marko was scarcely able to comprehend his own existence. He felt as if he were looking in a million directions at once, as if every molecule, particle grain, of his body form was infused with its own little piece of his consciousness. Worse, each wanted to go in a different direction. Just trying to hold his body together was like undertaking the notoriously problematic job of herding cats. It was all Marko could do to focus sufficiently and form the sketchy outline of a human being. His awareness had likewise been scattered to the four winds, but as he physically pulled himself together, his shattered consciousness began to reassert itself. He held up the extended, crudely shaped, sandy stumps that constituted his arms, and stared at them. "How are you staring? You have no finished eyes. What part of you is seeing this? All of you, every particle of your body is aware of every other part. It's just a matter of figuring out how to use it. You have to. Penny needs you to." With only the slightest dawning of comprehension, there was a thing above you. A thing that made a noise like a million screaming bees. It did something to you. It made you a freak. Penny's father is a freak. Oh my god, what will Penny say? Of his predicament. He looked down. You don't need to. You already know what you're going to see because that part of your body is already seeing it. And saw that his body ended at the waist. He was merged with the ground. To an observer, it might have almost appeared comical. He looked like some poor sap who had fallen asleep at the beach, and some kids had come along and buried him. Except this ain't no day at the beach. Laugh. That's right, laugh, clown, laugh so he won't scream. Because if you start screaming, you're never gonna stop. He always cried. The disdainful words of his wife came back to him, and he knew them to be true because he was crying now at the freak he had become. His shoulders were slumped, and they began to shake with great racking sobs. But there were no tears. He had no tear ducts, or eyes, or bodily organs of any sort. His existence completely impossible, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd be better off dead. Except he wasn't entirely sure that he wasn't already dead. This might just be some bizarre form of hell on Earth, and he was suffering this torment for everything he had done wrong. Then the glint of something shining in the sunlight caught his "No eye. You have no eye. Not one, but not two. Nothing, you freak, you." Attention. It was buried in the outer perimeter of the sandy base that formed his lower body, and he seeped tentatively towards it. Spiraling into hopelessness, he drew desperate succor from that glint and everything it represented. It lay half open in the sand, and he reached for it. He found that his crudely shaped hand was unable to grasp it. It slipped through his fingers like sand. Isn't that just too sick for words? and for a moment despair threatened to seize him once more. He pushed it away, determined not to allow that to happen. There was no way that he was going to be so close to the locket and everything it stood for, his one link to humanity, and fail. Burning with furious intensity, he closed his hand. He remembered the story about the sculptor who claimed that the secret to his art was simplicity itself. All he needed to do was chip away everything that didn't resemble the image he had in mind. Marko now followed that same philosophy. He visualized exactly what he wanted his hand to look like. He didn't stop until he could see it perfectly. And then he willed the vague mitten-like appendage at the end of his hand to mimic it. Fingers began to form, and they were still made of sand, but they were clear and distinct, and most importantly, hard. Tentatively, almost afraid to find out whether it would work, he reached down and gasped with joy as the newly created fingers deftly picked up the locket. He raised it so that it was at eye level and gazed at the image of the smiling young girl within. In a gravelly, raspy voice, Marko said softly, "Penny." Just speaking her name aloud was enough to galvanize his determination. He had been given a second chance at survival. More, he started to realize that he had been thinking of his status all wrong. Yes, he was a freak, but that didn't mean that it made him less than a man, less than human. If he could pull himself together, so to speak, he could become far more than either. Penny's picture, her name said aloud, the thought of what he could accomplish on her behalf, provided all the incentive he required, indeed, all that and more. Marko became emboldened, as if he were truly alive for the first time in his existence. He had no internal organs, no blood, no heart. But the locket substituted for that most vital of organs as he clutched it against his chest, tightly, and drew strength from it. Willing himself to stand, he started to rise, the sand beneath him coming together to form rudimentary legs. "I'm doing it. I'm doing it." He celebrated his success too soon, as the sandy columns proved inadequate to support his weight. He crumbled like the tower of a child's sandcastle. Moments earlier, that would have been enough to cause him to break down in despair. But it was now no longer the case. He was convinced he was going to triumph over his present circumstances. That it was simply a matter of when, not if. Marko took a mental step back and envisioned once more what he wanted the lower half of his body to do. The legs reformed, this time more dense than before. Quickly, before he could topple once more, he willed feet to come into existence. They did so, supporting him and providing balance where he had none earlier. He stayed there for a time, just making sure that he could keep this up. He didn't want to rush his first step. He had plenty of time. After all, no one ever saw sand on a beach in a hurry, did they? Human rules and priorities no longer applied to him. He was of the earth now. Immortal? Quite possibly. Like unto a god? Too soon to say, but it couldn't be ruled out. He took an unsteady step forward. It was difficult recapturing muscle memory when one didn't have any actual muscles anymore, but he was going to do his best. He couldn't help but think he probably bore a strong resemblance to Frankenstein's monster, lurching forward with his arms outstretched to help maintain his balance, staggering one step at a time. That was only temporary, though. Soon he would be walking relatively normally. He would sculpt his body so that it was indistinguishable from what it had been before. Yet anyone who thought that he or she could approach him, deal with him, treat him with the way that Flint Marko had been treated before, was going to discover that there had been a major paradigm shift. To his ex-wife, he had been a figure of contempt upon whom she could blame everything wrong with her life. To the cops, he was just a dumb con, a slob who had gotten lucky in eluding them for as long as he had, and deserved to rot in jail. Only Penny had seen the real Flint Marko. Only Penny loved him, and yet she was the one that a cruel God was intent on removing from the world. Now it seemed, though, that God wasn't as cruel as Marko had been supposing. Marko had been given this amazing gift, and he was going to use it for all it was worth. He was going to use it to help Penny, reward her for her love and devotion. Penny Marko's dead father had risen from his grave, and heaven help anyone who got in his way. For if they sowed the storm, they would reap the sandstorm. 7. Priorities. Mary Jane Watson sprinted up the stairwell in Peter's apartment building, clutching the newspaper to her chest. She was doing everything she could to keep herself together, furious over her self-pity and inability to remember what was important. Mere hours ago, she had been at the hospital where Harry Osborn might well have died. Yet he had survived. And wasn't that really far more important than the contents of the paper she was holding? Didn't one really have to prioritize in life? And she stopped, gripping the stairwell railing as a wave of nausea passed over her, and realized she was coming close to throwing up because she was so upset. She waited until the impulse was gone, then made it the rest of the way up. She banged on the door and heard a distracted, "Yeah?" from within. Obviously, Peter was studying. He always sounded as if he were speaking to her from the surface of Mars when his mind was occupied with his school books. Normally, she found it charming. This day, she found nothing charming. "It's me," she said. Peter had given her a key to the front door of the apartment building in which he lived, but she needed his aid to come into the apartment. "Hey, come in," his voice came. She rolled her eyes in annoyance. "You know I can't open the door. Pull it and give it a good shove." He still sounded distracted. Clearly he was in the middle of studying and didn't want to be bothered to get up. At that moment she would have kicked the door open if she weren't afraid of breaking her leg. She wasn't ruling out the possibility of kicking him, though. "Just come on and help me." Her tone of voice made it clear that she was fed up, and if he didn't get off his ass and open up, she was going to turn around and leave, and it would be a cold day in hell before she saw him again. Obviously, she had managed to convey her mood exactly because she heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from the desk. Yep, studying. And moments later, Peter swung the door open and looked at her quizzically. She held up the newspaper in response. Clearly, he didn't understand because he said, "What?" "The review," she replied icily. "The review, I forgot." He hit his forehead with the base of his hand and obviously thought he knew what the problem was. He assumed she was annoyed with him because he had forgotten that her play's opening night notices were going to be hitting the streets. She was holding the New York Times, unarguably the foremost paper in setting critical reception in New York City. Indeed, most of the other papers were irrelevant. The Times could make or break you. "How was it? Great?" She felt her throat constricting with fury. "They hated it! They hated me!" Peter looked as if he thought either Mary Jane had read it wrong or he had heard her wrong. "Well, they can't hate you," he assured her, as if she had said something on par with announcing that Congress had endeavored to repeal the law of gravity. In response, she turned to the Arts and Leisure section and began to read aloud. She'd uttered each word in a tense, clipped manner. "The young Miss Watson is a pretty girl. Easy on the eyes, but not on the ears. Her small voice didn't carry past the first row." "That's ridiculous," Peter assured her. "I was right there." "You were in the first row." "So something was wrong with the acoustics, or the sound guys didn't have you wired properly. Any one of 100 technical things, none of which have anything to do with you or your performance." Seeing she wasn't mollified, he took the newspaper from her, tossed it aside, and put his hands gently on her shoulders. "Listen, you have to know you were great. This is something you just have to get used to. You can't take it so personally. I've been through it. Spider-Man gets attacked all the time. Spider-Man isn't your real name. At least you have something to hide behind. I don't." Here, Peter was nattering on about his alter ego. How could he not understand? "This isn't about you. It's about me. She snapped at him, probably more angrily than she should have, but she didn't care. It's about my career. I know, exactly, he said, as if they were on the same wavelength, when she knew they weren't. And all you have to do is believe in yourself and pull yourself together. You get right back up on that horse. She clamped a hand over his surprised mouth. Don't give me the horse thing. He nodded in mute acknowledgement, and she removed her hand, but she was no less frustrated. Why was someone as intelligent as Peter being so dense? Try to understand how I feel. I look at these words and it's like my father wrote them. Understanding dawned on Peter's face. He knew full well that Mary Jane's father had lived for tearing her down at every opportunity. When she had wanted to embark on her acting career, her father had been her first and loudest critic. She had been determined to prove him wrong in his negative assessment of her abilities. Now it was looking as if her father was correct. Peter took a moment to regroup and started to open his mouth to reply, when the police radio he kept on his desk crackled to life. Keyed into the emergency frequency, it only went active when something truly major was hitting the band. That happened now, and Mary Jane saw Peter wince as the voice, static-filled since Peter's eavesdropping connection wasn't exactly legal, announced, "All units in the vicinity of 56th and Madison, report. Large crane out of control. Approach with caution. 56th and Madison. Pedestrians in danger." Instantly, Mary Jane felt conflicted. Part of her wanted Peter to ignore it, to focus on her. On the other hand, how could she be that selfish? Yes, her career was on the line, her ego was on the line, but so were lives. Careers could be rebuilt, shattered egos restored, but dead was dead. If Peter could save their lives... She hated this. She hated that she couldn't even seek solace from her boyfriend without it turning into a major soul-searching referendum on her priorities as a woman and a human being. Peter stared at her, waiting for some clue as to what she was thinking. She gave none. She just gazed at him with an impassive face. She didn't even give him the slightest twitch of an expression when the sound of a siren blew in the front window. As if he were prompting her because she'd missed a cue, he said hopefully, "Go get him, Tiger?" He never even considered staying for me. But what did you want him to say? "Don't worry, honey, let people's lives be at risk. This is more important." Except this is more important, to me at least. My God, how can you even think that? She lowered her head, feeling frustrated, feeling ashamed, feeling angry that she had come seeking emotional support, and all she had gotten was more frustration and conflict. First, the review had belittled her talent. Now she herself was belittling her values as a person. A little more support like this, and she'd be ready to throw herself off the roof. There was a sound at the window, and she turned and realized that, as she'd been standing there zoning out in distractions, Peter had changed into his costume and was standing at the open window, his mask in his hand, one foot on the sill. "Wait for me?" he asked, hopeful. Mary Jane made no reply, since she had no clue as to whether she would. He pulled on his mask, fired a web line, and swung away. Mary Jane stared for a long time at the open window, at the emptiness that it represented. There was something tremendously symbolic in that. She remembered when she'd sprinted here in her wedding dress, convinced that she had been running towards something. Now she began to wonder if, instead, she'd simply been running away from something else. She felt lonely, directionless. Support from critics hadn't been there for her professionally. Support from Peter hadn't been there emotionally. Yet she felt guilty for feeling this way, and perhaps that was what rankled her most of all. She wondered if this was how a doctor's wife felt, always playing second fiddle to the needs of her husband's patients. That wasn't really the same, though. A successful doctor's wife had a home, and friends, and at least she didn't have to worry about her husband being killed on the job. She supposed she was closer to a policeman's wife. Even then, though, an entire support system was in place. Other spouses of cops who understood the risks, plus a salary, benefits. Mary Jane was in a unique club. She had no one to whom she could talk about her feelings, no one to share her frustrations or concerns. She had thought she had Peter, but it was Spider-Man who really had Peter, had possessed him, taken him over. She had believed she could understand, had wanted to be supportive, but she desperately needed to be the focus of Peter's world. Not all the time, just occasionally. She had to know that she came first. She glared at the radio that was continuing its distress warning and had an epiphany. She would never, ever come first. Total strangers would always be more important to Peter than she was. It both galled and mortified her that she was angry about it. Galling and mortifying me. What the hell kind of match was such a selfish girl with such an unselfish guy? Mary Jane walked over to the desk where his open science books lay, afforded them a quick glance, crumpled the newspaper, and dumped it in the trash can. She headed for the door, pulled it open, then turned and glanced back at the room once more, wondering if she was ever going to set foot in it again. Might as well, you already abandoned the astronaut at the altar. Gonna burn down some more bridges? Something curious caught her eye. Peter, a typical guy, had left clothes strewn around, and she noticed his dress shoes lying in the corner in the shadows. One of them had a huge chunk of what looked like black tar on the sole. She wondered what in the world Peter had stepped in. She picked the shoe up and glanced around to find a rag to clean it off, then stopped herself and wondered just how much of a glutton for punishment she was. Peter had ditched her to go off and be a hero. She was an emotional wreck over it, and she was going to fix his shoes in the midst of all this? Mary Jane shook her head at her own foolishness, tossed the shoe aside, walked out the door, and closed it behind her. The shoe landed in the sunlight near the radio. The radio blared loudly, and feedback caused a high, shrill tone to cut through the air. As soon as that happened, the ebony substance on Peter's shoe pulsed, flexed, then peeled itself off the sole. It left a small part of itself behind, but didn't seem especially slowed by it. It moved quickly away from the sunlight, away from the radio, undulating across the floor as fast as it could. Within seconds, it had made it to the cool, quiet darkness of the closet, slithering inside and taking refuge in the shadows once more. Unaware of the unearthly drama unfolding in the apartment she'd just left, Mary Jane was walking down the hallway when she found her way blocked by Ursula, the wafer-thin daughter of Peter's landlord. Mary Jane had spotted her before, looking at Peter with the puppy dog eyes that only a teen girl with a hopeless crush could possibly affect. Just hold out, Cope, kid. Maybe someday soon you'll be old enough so you can have your heart cut in half, too. Hi, Mary Jane, Ursula said with forced perkiness. Hi. MJ started to step around her, in no mood for conversation. Ursula didn't move aside. MJ didn't think she was being rude. She was just oblivious to the fact that Mary Jane wanted to leave. How's Peter? Ursula asked. He went out. From the unblinking surprise in Ursula's face, Mary Jane instantly realized she'd given the wrong answer. Who knew how long Ursula had been standing there? Who would have known that Peter hadn't gone past her? And she was too credulous to consider the possibility that Mary Jane might be lying, and Peter was still up in his apartment. Still, she sounded dubious as she said, "He always goes so fast." Very fast. Seeing that Ursula wasn't moving anytime soon, and surrendering to the inevitability of a conversation, she forced herself to appear interested as she asked, "What are you up to?" "Not much. Washing dishes at a jazz club." Since that clearly wasn't especially interesting, she added, "The waitresses sing. I can't sing. Can you sing?" Of all the questions to ask. She thought of Peter's excuses as to how the critics got it wrong. But she also considered that, if she'd read that review about someone else, she would have taken the critics' assessment at face value. So why then, but not now? Making one of the most difficult admissions she'd ever uttered, Mary Jane said, "I don't know." 8. The Eyes of Eddie Brock. Unaware that all hell was about to break loose, the photo shoot in the law offices of Miller and Ingersoll, Esquire, continued blissfully along with music blaring and photographer clicking. The offices had been rented for the day, no big deal since both attorneys were in court, by the publishers of an office supply catalog. 3 comely models, a blonde, brunette, and a redhead, were draping themselves over the latest model office copier and desperately trying to make mundane photocopying look sexy. They were oblivious that, just outside at a construction site, a crane operator had been hoisting a massive steel girder above the street. Warning lights had flashed on the control panel within the cab, and the crane operator had struggled desperately to bring things back under his command. His efforts were well-intentioned but futile, and he had screamed into the microphone connecting him to the foreman, "I've lost control! Shut it down!" His foreman tried to do just that, but was thwarted by the very problem that had caused the controls to go out of whack in the first place: a short in the transformer. Sparks flew out of it, several of them bouncing against a sign with an interchangeable number on it that read 79 days accident-free, leaving small scorch marks. The foreman had yanked the shut-off override switch, and instead of shutting down the crane, had received a sizable jolt that blew him backward. The crane began to swing wildly, and all while its erstwhile operator could do was watch in horror and wish for a miracle. Meanwhile, the 3 models alternated chatting about guy matters while tossing smiles at the photographer. The brunette was an exotic-looking Latina named J.J. Sachs, with a mane of curly black hair and olive skin. She exuded sexuality the way that other mere mortals exuded sweat. The redhead, Wendy Goldstein, had slightly round face and short cropped hair. Of the 3, she was having the toughest time making upbeat expressions. Clearly a good deal was on her mind, and the smile that she plastered onto her face at the photographer's command seemed forced. The blonde model attempted to forestall any problems that Wendy might be having by offering advice. The blonde was Gwen Stacy, Peter Parker's lab partner at Empire State University, and as she struck a pose in which she was caressing the photocopier, she urged Wendy, "Don't fight with him, it doesn't fix anything." "But that's all he wants to do," Wendy complained. "Well, tell him if all you do is talk about the relationship, there's no time to have one." "Everybody hold it," called Ernie Schultz, the heavy-set and increasingly annoyed photographer. Liking the position they were in, he fired off a few quick shots. But when Wendy opened her mouth to address Gwen, he anticipated it by calling out, "Stop talking! Hold it!" Wendy's mouth snapped shut like a lobster trap, and he continued, "Give me office efficiency, but with bedroom eyes. Not sleepy, Wendy." Gwen was beginning to feel exhausted. She had no aspiration toward being a model. She just answered the call for the gig at the university bulletin board as a means of picking up some extra money. She'd figured, how hard could it be to stand around and get your picture taken while smiling? Gwen was getting the answer. Her face was starting to hurt, and she was certain that her smile looked as artificial as it felt. She was copying a feel on a photocopying machine, for heaven's sake. How was someone supposed to get enthused about something like that? Clearly, Ernie was getting a sense of her frustration. He lowered his camera and said impatiently, "Look, I know you're new at this, but you're not giving me what I need. He groped for the right words. "I need mystery. I need..." "A new personality?" Gwen suggested with wide-eyed innocence. Wendy and JJ choked back laughter, but the photographer completely missed the veiled insult. "Yes!" he declared as if the Holy Grail had just been presented him. "Some life, some..." He'd been peering through the viewfinder, trying to compose a different shot, and now he was looking up in annoyance. "Now what's that thing doing in my background?" His background consisted of a New York skyline visible out the wide windows behind them. Gwen turned to see what he was talking about, and at first she wasn't clear on what she was seeing either. It was moving quickly, but the shadows of the skyscrapers were obscuring it, and she couldn't... Then her eyes widened in horror as she saw the massive arm of a construction crane swinging toward them at high speed. Dangling beneath it was a teetering girder. Gwen was paralyzed with denial, certain the thing wasn't going to hit. Or perhaps she was dreaming of something that she had seen in an action or disaster movie. She remained that way for several precious seconds until her mind processed reality. Then, as the wildly swinging girder hurtled toward them, she screamed, "Get down!" Everyone dove to the floor as the spinning girder shattered the windows. Glass flew everywhere. Gwen kept her eyes shut, terrified of being blinded by flying shards, as small pieces of broken window littered her hair. The girder kept going, smashing lighting fixtures, sending sparks flying and annihilating a row of desks, reducing them to splinters. Then, just as quickly and surreally as it had appeared, the girder was whisked out the window. Ernie, Gwen, JJ, and Wendy slowly got to their feet. Standing in the middle of the office wreckage, they quietly marveled at not only the amount of destruction, but that they were still alive to see it. Still stunned, they picked their way through it, inspecting the damage. Impressed by the photographic possibilities the devastation offered, Ernie snapped off a few shots. A high-pitched whistling of wind filled the wrecked office. As one, they turned and saw a massive shadow sweeping over them. "It's coming back!" shouted Ernie. Having no desire to press their luck and uncertain they'd be fortunate enough to survive a second pass, the four bolted for the door. The girder suddenly dipped, swung low, and slammed into the building 1 story below them. That was way too close, thought Gwen. Ernie was leading the way, or more likely was just trying to save his own ass, as he threw open the door and charged through. Wendy was tight behind them, with JJ and Gwen bringing up the rear. Suddenly, the entire office violently tilted, as if it were constructed on a giant seesaw. The girder must have taken out the structural support columns on the floor below them, and now the entire office structure where they were was pitching downward at a 45-degree angle. JJ had been sliding as well, but she had grabbed hold of a metal strut in the floor that had been ripped open by the girder's initial pass-through. She threw her arm out, trying to snag the sliding Gwen, but Gwen went right past her. The open window yawned before Gwen as she went toward it, grabbing at the smooth floor and unable to find purchase. She tried slapping her open hands flat on the floor, perhaps in the vain hope that she might suddenly acquire adhesive powers like Spider-Man. This only slowed her down for a few seconds. Meantime, pencils, cans of soda, and rolling chairs skidded past her, tumbling out the smashed window and falling to the street below. She would inevitably have followed, save that a ringing telephone of all things grabbed her attention. It had fallen off one of the smashed desks, and the cord was jacked into the wall. She snagged the receiver as she slid past, and receiver, phone unit, and Gwen all started to slide toward oblivion. Miraculously, the cord, all of 249 at Radio Shack, remained affixed to the wall, stubbornly refusing to release its hold. Everything that wasn't bolted down slid past Gwen and out. Clinging wildly, she heard a tinny voice coming through the phone receiver. "Hello? Hello?" she screamed. The voice on the phone came back at her with sunny cheerfulness that didn't exactly match the moment. "You've got the rockin' sound of WKRQ. If you can name our last two for Tuesday songs, you could be our grand prize winner." "Help! I can't hold on!" she shrieked at the receiver. "Right you are," chipped the DJ. "Help and I can't hold on. Pack your bags, miss, 'cause you're going on a trip." With a remarkable, if morbid, sense of comedic timing, the telephone cord chose that moment to give up the ghost. It snapped, and Gwen continued toward the open window. It waited for her like the maw of a great beast, knowing that sooner or later patience would pay off and it would swallow her up. She slid right out the window, but at the last second snagged a jutting piece of the steel window frame. Dangling in midair, her legs pinwheeling as if she were riding an invisible bicycle, Gwen Stacy hung 100 stories above the street. In an insane digression, Her mind flashed to when she was a little girl and had leaned too far out of the bedroom window of her queen's home. Before she could tumble down, a hand reached out and grabbed her. The terrified child, realizing how close she had come to seriously injuring herself, sobbed into the chest of the man who had saved her. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she had wailed, afraid that she was going to be punished. Instead, her father had simply held her close, whispered that it was going to be okay, that her being all right was the only thing that mattered. And he assured her in that low, gravelly voice of his, "I'll never let you fall." The frightened little girl in Gwen Stacy now irrationally wondered where her father was, and if he was going to make good on that promise. Half a dozen police cars were already on the scene when Police Captain George Stacy leapt out of his vehicle. He was tall, with an angular face and eyes that alternated between being kind and understanding or fiercely penetrating and threatening, depending on whether he was dealing with a victim or a suspected criminal. Now they were filled only with concern. A police officer, DeFalco, rushed up to him. "They got some kind of short up there, and they can't shut down the crane." "Get Con Ed on the phone," Captain Stacy ordered. "Have them kill the power to the whole block." "Yes, sir." "And get me a rescue team up there," he shouted. People screamed as debris started hitting the streets. The crowd, pressing forward like curious sheep to get a better look, almost stampeded trying to get back out of the way, as various pieces of office furniture tumbled from high above and either crashed to the pavement or ricocheted off parked cars. Car alarms howled in protest as the vehicles' roofs and hoods were crushed by plummeting furniture. The crowd scampered backward. Stacy looked at the falling debris and thought, "Dear God, please, no bodies. Dear God, please, let's see some bodies." Fresh-faced, short-cropped, blonde Eddie Brock, camera equipment hanging from a strap around his neck, with an expression like a starving dog seeing fresh meat dangled in front of him, came rolling up to the site of the crane emergency in a yellow cab. He practically had to throw himself in the taxi's path to grab it. Anyone else would have considered it a fluke that Brock, tossing back drinks in a local bar, had seen the unfolding crisis on a news report and realized it was only 10 blocks away. But Eddie Brock didn't believe in luck. He believed in destiny. And he further believed that he was destined for greatness. And no cab with the pathetic excuse of being off duty was going to deter him from getting over to the scene of an accident as fast as humanly possible, camera at the ready. As he clambered out of the cab, telling the driver to keep the change, he slapped his Daily Bugle identification on his sweater so that the police could tell at a glance that he was not one of the mere masses. He was a man with a job to do, same as they had. With any luck, neither of them would get in each other's way while they were doing it. Brock approached the scene with a very different mental attitude from Captain Stacy's. He was looking for the most dramatic shots. He heard someone shouting, "Get that taxi out of there!" But the cab was already on its way out. Brock sidestepped a police rescue team and brought his camera up, looking for something truly juicy. He fired off several quick shots of the girder flapping around in midair, but he knew even as he did that it was boring. The almighty newspaper axiom was, if it bleeds, it leads. The ideal situation would be to get a shot of someone plummeting to his or her death. That was page 1 material. That was the stuff that Pulitzers were made of. Never once did Eddie Brock question the ethics or morality of his way of thinking. Why should he? It wasn't as if he had set these events into motion. People were going to die or not as the fates decreed. But there was no escaping that pictures of their plunging demise were going to be incredibly memorable. The most memorable pictures in the world depicted innocent people suffering, like that famous shot of that screaming, naked Vietnamese girl fleeing her burning village. Eddie Brock desperately wanted his own piece of immortality, and if it came at the expense of someone else's mortality, well, he could live with that. Scanning the building exterior, he was suddenly certain he saw a tiny form high above. It wasn't falling, but it was on the verge of doing so. He pulled out his extreme telephoto lens, brought it up to his trained eye, and zoomed in on what now appeared to be a helpless blonde fighting for the last few seconds of her life. Good. That was good. Dying females were even more compelling than dying males, and this looked to be a gorgeous one, too. He lowered the camera, all the blood draining from his face. My God, that's Gwen. Shock pounded through his brain. No longer was this some anonymous woman whose death might, if photographed properly, help make his career. This was Gwen Stacy. His Gwen. Briefly, he considered not taking the picture. Then he brought the camera back up to his eye and refocused. He watched in helpless frustration, but snapping shots the entire time as bits of metal started flying past Gwen's head. The rivets that connected the window frame to the building were popping out one by one. Suddenly, Gwen opened her mouth and was undoubtedly screaming. Eddie couldn't hear it, of course, but he saw her mouth open wide as in the famous Munch painting. And then the metal frame tore away from the building. It swung 30 feet outward and left Gwen dangling high above the intersection. There was no way she was going to be able to hold on, and nowhere for her to go even if she managed to do so. Brock's mind was blank. He was entirely on autopilot as he continued to make a visual diary of Gwen Stacy's last moments. He was so absorbed with what he was seeing that when he heard a triumphant whoop of joy from the crowd, he assumed it to be people who were excited over witnessing an imminent death. Sick bastards. I don't know how people can live with themselves. All the while he kept shooting. Gwen's fingertips slipped from the girder, and with a shriek, she started to fall. She won't be alive when she hits the ground. A fall from that height. No, she'll be dead long before. It'll be merciful. Quick. On film forever. You'll be immortal, Gwen. Even though you'll be dead, I'll make sure you're immortalized. A flash of red and blue hurtled across Brock's field of vision, blocking out his shot. Confused, Eddie switched from a tight angle to a wide, and was astounded to see that Gwen was in the arms of Spider-Man. He realized belatedly that the crowd had been responding to the sight of the web-slinger hurtling through the air and intercepting Gwen. Spider-Man scooped her up, and she threw her arms around him. Everything had happened so quickly that it had been barely seconds between the time that Brock had shouted, "My God, that's Gwen," and an older-looking uniformed cop approached him with a strange look on his face. Brock fully expected the cop to try and shoo him away from the scene. Instead, the policeman said, "Gwen?" Not understanding, Brock simply nodded in confirmation, and the cop grabbed the camera from Brock. The strap was still looped around Eddie's neck, nearly causing him to strangle as the stranger peered through the lens to see for himself. The cop gasped and said in confirmation upon seeing her, "That's my daughter." Brock made a gargling noise, pointed at the strap that was cutting off his air, and the cop promptly released his hold. As Eddie cleared his throat, the officer stared at him in confusion. "Who are you?" "Brock, sir. Edward Brock, Jr." Brock managed to say. He smoothed the front of his sweater. "I'm dating your daughter." He forced a smile as Captain Stacy simply stared at him as if he were a new type of fungus. "She's told me all about you." "Really? She hasn't mentioned you at all?" Captain Stacy said, not sounding particularly condescending. He was simply stating it as fact, attributing nothing to it in his voice. It was still enough to make Eddie feel cut off at the knees. Apparently giving Brock no further thought, Captain Stacy headed toward where Spider-Man was descending to street level. Spider-Man set Gwen gently down upon the ground. She almost toppled over from a combination of dizziness and, most likely, fear. Not fear of Spider-Man. She was gazing at him with awe and amazement. Certainly, the near-death experience itself, however, was enough to make anyone woozy. But before she took a spill, her father was there, catching her by one arm and supporting her. She looked in wonderment at him and said in an almost dreamlike voice, "I knew you wouldn't let me fall." Suddenly, Spider-Man was leaping skyward and began spinning some sort of webbing net directly above the crowd. Brock didn't understand why, and then a hail of concrete descended upon them from above. Scattered debris from the crumbled floor high overhead continued to rain down, and the hastily spun web held firm as the wreckage fell harmlessly on it. It sagged a bit under the weight, but didn't break. It was impossible to say how many fatalities there would have been if Spider-Man hadn't protected the bystanders. Satisfied that the people on the ground were safe, Spider-Man landed on a lamppost and stared up at the crane, which was still moving out of control. He was actually scratching his head, trying to figure out the best way to approach the problem, when every light on the street suddenly went out. The power shutdown caused a sound that was almost like a body's great exhalation of relief, and then the runaway crane came to a slow, grinding halt. A ragged cheer arose from the crowd. Eddie Brock quickly made his way over to where Captain Stacy was steadying his daughter. Brock had never seen any man look so relieved in his entire life. The moment he drew within earshot, he called to Gwen. "Beautiful. Pulitzer Prize." He tapped his camera. "Wait until you see that shot, Gwen. The light on your hair was golden." Gwen gave him that same, "Who are you?" look that her father had given him only moments before. Only then did it occur to Eddie Brock that he had just admitted to snapping shots of Gwen during what had seemed to be her tragic and violent death. Perhaps that wasn't the smartest thing to be crowing about. Spider-Man dropped lightly to the ground near them, turning to Gwen and asked, "Are you okay?" Even his voice wasn't what Brock had anticipated from a bigger-than-life hero. He had thought Spider-Man would have some deep, classic, booming hero voice, like a Shakespearean actor or something. Instead, Spider-Man just sounded like some guy. I need water. Hang on. There we go. That's good. Gwen, however, did not appear to be disappointed by either his voice or his height. Instead, with a look that bordered on adoration, she said, "I'm fine. Thank you, Spider-Man." Desperate to insert himself into the moment, Brock called out, "Hold it, Spidey! Smile!" Spider-Man turned and looked in his direction as Brock snapped away. "Are you smiling?" Brock asked. Spider-Man just continued to stare at him. "Just kidding," Brock said, feeling foolish and not knowing why he did. He squared his shoulders and, as he continued to take pictures, said, "Name's Eddie Brock. I'll be taking shots of you for the Bugle from now on." Spider-Man tilted his head slightly, like a curious dog. "What about that guy, Peter? What's his name?" "Strictly amateur," Brock replied dismissively. "Wouldn't know an F-stop from a bus stop. His stuff makes you look, bloated, just a little chunky." Spider-Man appeared to consider this. Then he fired a web line and swung off across the cityscape. A huge, rousing cheer went up as he departed. None of them saw Spider-Man, several blocks away, stop on a ledge in front of a window and study his full profile in reflection. He placed his hand flat on his stomach, then sucked in his gut. "Chunky?" he muttered, and decided right then and there that this Brock guy was not going to be on his Christmas card list. Total strangers would always be more important to Peter than she was. He's a superhero, you cunt. It's kind of his responsibility. I hate this character. Gwen Stacy was awesome. Why'd she have to die? Answering for Peter the question of how MJ had gotten in here. Don't tell me I'm losing my voice. This episode brought to you by Propel Water. It keeps me alive to do these things.